Thank you, Stephen. And thank you, Corey, and all of you who have been part of JFK Partners. I've heard it's been a terrific morning, and I'm following two very powerful videos of families whose lives were transformed by the work that goes on here. And I hope that gives all of you who have been part of this work a great deal of satisfaction that the work that you're doing is making a difference in people's lives in a really meaningful way. And I want to take this opportunity just to begin by introducing myself. It's hard to distinguish all of us as Kennedys because there's too many of us to count. In fact, I haven't seen this many people in the same room since I was over at my Aunt Ethel's house. So yes, I grew up in this incredible family and was bestowed this amazing legacy and last name when I was born. I had nothing to do with it, but I took full advantage of it. I was elected when I was 21 to the Rhode Island State House, and then at 27 to the United States Congress, and then at 31 to the leadership of the Democratic Party. And I know that none of it had to do with my last name being Kennedy whatsoever. It was all my good looks and personality that got me far. So I really remember, obviously, my Aunt Eunice was a dominant figure in all of our lives. And she was transformative because she herself, was spiritual and transformative in her person. She really was an incredible human being. The number of lives that she's touched is just outstanding. I can't tell you the number of times I walk through an airport and some family doesn't come up to me and tell me what a difference she made in their lives, that they thought that their lives would never amount to anything when their child was born with a developmental disability. And once they got to be involved with Let's Play to Grow, and they got to learn how to play with their children, and then they got involved with Special Olympics and learned that they were not isolated in the community, they were not marginalized, and that rather than feeling abandoned, they were embraced. I mean, God, if we could take that secret sauce and apply it throughout the country in terms of the challenges faced by those with brain illnesses and brain disorders. And I focus on brain because it's all the same organ of the body that unites us, and yet we often, in our work to try to develop a beachhead in order to make it possible for us to advocate on behalf of those that we love, we often kind of find ourselves fragmented because we organize around our particular diagnosis or disability. And what ends up happening is we end up not being able to come together at those crucial moments where if we work together, we'd get a lot further than if we stayed in our own silo. You've heard this message many times, I'm sure, but I'm just here to add my perspective as someone who worked in public policy in the most direct way as it relates to policies for those with brain illnesses. I was honored in the Congress to co-found the Down Syndrome Caucus, and Michelle Whitten is here and been a terrific champion for people with Down syndrome. And I really had the honor of working on that, as I did with other issues, on a bipartisan basis, because even in this partisan atmosphere that we live in, these are issues that truly unite people across political boundaries like no other. Really, frankly, like no other issue. My father used to say whenever he was in trouble politically, he would ask my Aunt Eunice to come and intervene for him because she was so beloved by the right wing of the Republican Party as much as by the left wing, that she seemed to have this incredible aura that allowed her to help mediate any political crisis my father found himself in. But I wanted to tell you kind of a little story about passing this mental health parity and Addiction Equity Act, which I had the honor of helping to author. And, as I said, was elected as the youngest member of Congress. I also came from the smallest state in the country, Rhode Island. And when I got elected, I was in the minority party. So that pretty much put me at the bottom of the heap politically. I mean, you couldn't get any lower on the rung than I was. But the way politics works, as I'm sure in academic institutions and business, if you want to have any real kind of ownership over an issue, you've got to be around a long time. I mean, you've got to earn those gray hairs or no hairs at all on the top of your head. You have got to put in the time, because people like my late father didn't end up being sponsor of a lot of important pieces of legislation by accident. They became sponsors because, as you may recall, my dad served in the Senate for 47 years. He was chairman of the principal committee on domestic legislation, the Labor, Health, Human Services, and Pension Committee. It didn't get more basic than that. So if he was chair of the committee and wanted to put his name first on a bill, then he just went ahead and did it because he was chairman. Or if he felt like there was some member of his committee that really cared deeply about an issue and was going to be the standard bearer, he gave them the sponsorship of the bill. And hence his junior, Senator Harkin, ended up being the champion of the Americans with Disability Act, which my dad was proud to chair and oversee the hearings, but he knew that Tom Harkin was the guy to be the standard bearer. And my dad won a lot of affection from his colleagues because he was always generous in spirit in terms of giving people that opportunity to shine. Because, of course, Ted Kennedy, he didn't need any more publicity. He was happy to share the limelight with whoever wanted it. And I think that made him a very successful legislator, needless to say. So I, in the House, asked my colleagues, particularly the clerk of the House, because I'd been sponsor of mental health parity in Rhode Island. And I was in Rhode Island, I was like number 32 as a list of co-sponsors. So when I got to Washington, I thought 435 members of Congress, I'll be lucky if I make it in the top 200 of co-sponsors. Can you imagine my surprise when I asked the clerk who was sponsoring the bill that required equal insurance coverage for the brain, as we would expect insurance coverage to cover any other organ of the body. And I was told, well, Congressman Kennedy, no one else is sponsoring that bill. If you want to be the sponsor, it's all yours. I say that to kind of help validate the fact that we still have a great deal of unease and stigma out there that we have to overcome as a society. And the notion that as the youngest member of Congress from the smallest state in the country and in the minority party, that I could end up having the distinct honor of putting my name first on a bill that simply said that insurance ought to cover the brain like it does any other organ of the body. So that was my first kind of realization about the challenge that we had ahead of us politically. We moved on, and as you know, we lost our greatest advocate, Paul Wellstone, tragically, and his family in a plane crash, and we were left with kind of a vacuum. And my dad, being chairman of the committee, took over for Paul Wellstone on the Senate side, and Jim Ramstad and I were the sponsors on the House side. And it was an interesting kind of debate because it illustrates this whole issue of fragmentation. So Pete Domenici, who is our champion in the Senate, been a real champion for those with severe and persistent mental illness, he was obviously motivated because of his daughter's experience, suffering from schizophrenia. And he was so uncertain that if we covered anything other than severe mental illness, that we would jeopardize the passage of the bill. This is in 2007. Okay, we're not talking about, just like we are seeing these tragic videos continue to unfold in this country with respect to race issues. It's hard to imagine that it was just a handful of years ago that there was no consensus within the advocacy community that we should all be behind the same bill, because guess what? We all face the same challenges, but to varying degrees. And the common struggle is the common struggle to be integrated into life and integrated into our healthcare system. In both cases, we face challenges. And in both cases, we're stronger together than we are divided. So what we had, it was a situation where all of the major advocacy groups took the side that if we were to add any additional kind of DSM diagnoses, we would basically jeopardize the passage of the bill. And something happened along the way, and we were in a situation where it was kind of a stalemate. And of course, whenever I wanted one of my bills passed, I called my dad, behind doors. I said, how are we going to get this done? And my dad at the time was suffering from brain cancer. So he was convalescing after surgery at the Cape, and yet he was able to say, what you need to do is talk to Chris. And of course, I knew what he meant. He meant Chris Dodd, who was taking his place on the health committee. But of course, we were approaching 2000, we're into 2008, and most people recall that Chris Dodd at that time was also chairman of the banking committee. So when I talked to Chris Dodd, I said, we've got to get this parity bill passed. We'd prefer that it was H.R. 1424, the House version, which includes all brain disorders. And Chris said, okay. And so then we had the tragic economic collapse in our country, the banks going belly up. It was a panic in Washington, D.C., because we were running up against re-election. Everyone felt like we were going to get tossed out of office because people would be reacting to the situation. And we were faced with whether we were going to bail out the very bankers that got us into the trouble in the first place. You can imagine how popular the idea of giving $800 billion to our nation's leading bankers was. It's not a bill that anyone wanted to vote for. These are the people that got us in the mess, and the way we're going to get out of the mess is give them more of our money. I mean, you can't make this up. Can't make this up. So we had $800+ billion of your tax dollars. You're all reeling because you just filed your taxes. I'm emphasizing that, $800 billion of your tax dollars to bail out the largest banks. And of course, the bill failed in the House. The last 5 minutes of the vote, these votes are 15 minutes, when it was clear we weren't going to get enough votes to pass the bill, the stock market dropped another 6,000 points in 8 minutes. That's how much the confidence in the market was shaken by the way we were responding. So long and short is we had to come back and pass the TARP bill, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. And I knew once we passed the TARP bill, we were going to go home and run for re-election. There was no other business that was going to keep us in Washington. So I said to Chris Dodd, we got to get it passed before the TARP, or we're all done. And so the day rolls around, TARP passes the House, goes over to the Senate. Of course, at this point, there's no debate. We just got to get the bill passed. And a funny thing happens. Chris Dodd wrote the whole $800 billion toxic asset relief program, bailout of the banks, largest bailout in American history. He wrote all of the bill's language into H.R. 1424 and sent it back to the House for concurrent passage, which meant that you're looking not only at the author of the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, but the author of the largest federal bailout in American history. It's funny. Again, you can't make this up. But what it illustrated is that people didn't come out and say, wouldn't it be great if we finally treated everyone with brain illness the same? And, listen, it's been 50 years since John F. Kennedy, signed the Community Mental Health Act. Wouldn't it be great if we finally fulfilled that vision, he said. And he said it so eloquently. He said, for those that are alien to our affections, they should no longer be alien to our affections or beyond the help of our communities. That's what he said. And if you want to encapsulate our challenge as a nation for those facing intellectual disabilities and discrimination thereof, or mental illness and addiction, they are alien to our affections, but they are not beyond the help of our communities. And so the challenge is we can change laws, we just can't always change attitudes. And we've learned that poignantly on the 50th anniversary of the civil rights struggle and Selma, only to see these struggles of race continue in our country. But what they illustrate is you can pass the Civil Rights Act, but you've got to still work on changing attitudes and our culture. And of course, that is the reason why passing a law outlawing discrimination is important, but it's not the whole challenge. So what you all have been doing today with these ground rounds is to start to learn that you have to check your attitudes. As progressive as an enlightened person you think you are, you constantly have to check your attitudes because we're all a product of our environment. And even in the most progressive households, even like my own, these illnesses were still stigmatized. I mean, here I was the author of the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, and when I went to treatment for my mental illness and addiction, I didn't want to be sent to the Generos building. And the place that I was going to get treatment, the Generos building, was where all the mentally ill were. I said, don't you know who I am? I'm a congressman. You can't send me down there. And here I was, the sponsor of the act, trying to change the attitudes of discrimination in our country towards these illnesses. So, of course, I got treated in the main hospital, St. Elizabeth's, and they tried to bring over all of their complement of services from the Generos building, but it didn't quite do it. And so 6 months later, I ended up back that same hospital, this time in the Generos building. And the point I wanted to make is the fact that we ought to have a situation where people do not feel marginalized by their healthcare system, where they somehow have to get their healthcare somewhere else, outside of where everyone else gets their healthcare. And, we have a number of challenges in this area, but I think we're making progress due to the kinds of efforts that you're making and these fantastic JFK centers that were established to really be multidisciplinary sites where you could integrate from the very beginning a child and a family's health care so that it could be seamless and people wouldn't end up literally falling through the cracks of a bureaucracy where one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. So the crucial aspect of this was bringing people together in an integrated way. And it's just the same way that Eunice did with Special Olympics, bringing everybody together. She ended up helping to spur her brother, my late uncle, President Kennedy, to do in these JFK centers that were really a product of the foundation that was named in my other late uncle's name, Joseph B. Kennedy, Jr., who died in World War II while trying to, in the first type of drone attack, steer his plane full of explosives into Nazi Germany in order to take out the buzz bombs that were terrorizing London when the plane exploded. And so he was the love of my grandparents' life. He was the apple of their eye. And they decided to put all their money behind this institution of the Joseph B. Kennedy Jr. Foundation. They weren't sure how it was going to manifest itself. And of course, at the time, my Aunt Rosemary was not someone who was integrating even within our family. My grandfather felt so bad about the worst, perhaps, medical decision that any family could have ever made, worst medical kind of procedure anyone could go through, a lobotomy. And my Aunt Rosemary ended up even further disabled and then sent to a convent treatment in Wisconsin. And during my grandfather's life, really was not seen or heard from because of the shame that was surrounded the way my family felt about that whole tragedy. And my Aunt Eunice, amidst all of it, was really pushing for her brother, the new president, to make sure that they used this foundation to make a difference in the life of the person in their family who they felt the closest to. And my Rosemary and President Kennedy were the closest of the siblings in age. And my father would tell stories about how they'd be at a party growing up, and President Kennedy would always go over and sit with Rosemary. So you think about, what inspired the JFK centers. It was a deep commitment to justice and making sure that people weren't left out. And then Eunice, just through happenstance, tried to make sure people weren't left out by having them all over to her house. And that ended up being the Special Olympics. I mean, again, you can't make this up. It's a beautiful story. And later, as I grew older, my Aunt Rosemary used to come and visit us all the time. And she would go everywhere with us. We'd go down to the Hyannisport Yacht Club. And no one at the yacht club quite knew what to do when Rosemary arrived. And of course, it just made all my Shriver cousins so excited because they love to kind of shake it up. And how beautiful that the experience with my Aunt Rosemary paved the way for their understanding and embrace of their father when my Uncle Sarge came down with Alzheimer's. Because wouldn't you know that the same way Rosemary was included in everything, my Uncle Sarge was included in everything, all the way to the end of his days. He'd be at every dining room table, making sure we never forgot that he was there. And I feel blessed that I had those experiences because it's made me a more sensitive person and a more understanding person. But even the most enlightened amongst us, unless we have those experiences, don't come by that sensitivity and understanding by accident. And that's why these JFK centers are so valuable, because the interdisciplinary approach that involves the parents and the family is the key, not only to help the parents understand how their loved one, their child's going to navigate this new bureaucracy called disability and health care and the two worlds in between, but how those in the healthcare system can be more sensitive to families and their challenges along the way. Because, every person will need a multitude of different services throughout their lives. And that will mean that all those specialties will have to have an understanding and appreciation for the unique challenges of those with intellectual disabilities and the unique challenges of those with a mental illness or substance use disorder. That's what it comes down to. And my friends, I wish I could tell you in this day and age that our medical schools and our hospitals and our training programs bring that kind of sensitivity in the delivery of health care in this country. But I'm sad to say, even on the 50th anniversary of John F. Kennedy saying that people shouldn't be alien to our affections or beyond the help of our communities, they still are in many places in this country because they fail to have the kind of programs that you're celebrating today really help bring an appreciation and understanding to all the clinicians who are going to go out there in their lives and serve everybody. Not just some folks, but everybody. And since all of us live on the spectrum somewhere, okay, we're all going to need brain health somewhere along the line. And wouldn't it be great if we start to bring a culture of understanding into the medical profession that can follow someone throughout the course of their life. I often say that, we need a checkup from the neck up, from cradle to grave. The notion that we don't include brain health in all of our physicals to a large extent is really a residual leftover from the past. It needs to be included, and that means bringing mental health to those with intellectual disabilities. Even my cousin Tim Shriver, who's now taken over for the Special Olympics, the International Special Olympics, which he's president of, tells me that he says, we have the Healthy Athletes program. We do the eye checks, the hearing checks, we do the other checks. But Patrick, we don't do any check for their anxiety and their depression. He said, can you help us? I said, let's do it. Let's do it together. The notion that we are celebrating this 50th and we're only beginning now to think about including mental health in the Healthy Athletes program of the Special Olympics. And we've had integrated sports for years. It just tells you how much further we have to go. So I'm trying to tell all of you who are just going into this field, we need you. We need you to be aware and to be proponents and advocates for bringing people together. So, I was interested to find when I was in Congress serving on the NIH Appropriations Committee that we had over a dozen institutes within the NIH that study the brain. And none of them talk to each other. Until recently, the last couple of years, they've got this blueprint. But it's shocking that all of their work is in really in a silo. When I challenge anyone to find any one of us who has got a kind of one particular homogeneous set of characteristics. The question of our population is a heterogeneous kind of population with multitude of challenges, and the notion that we don't try to do larger trials and integrate an analytics toolkit that allows us to understand why it is that certain people are facing certain challenges and what we can do to help mitigate those challenges through the discovery of new interventions. We have the ability, ironically, to do this today like we've never been able to do it before. And that's another legacy of John F. Kennedy, because the ability to combine the ability to study algorithms and where personalized medicine comes into play when it comes to brain disorders, you're talking about the most complex organ of the body with a multitude of moving factors. and trying to integrate all of that data to understand how and where to provide what the President Obama says is precision medicine to help those with brain illnesses is a challenge beyond our thinking. But it's now made more possible by the ability for us to have the kind of algorithmic research that can go on in and amongst these institutes, where they can begin to use common data elements to describe all of the science that they're doing so that they can adequately integrate what they're learning in one institute with what they're trying to research in another institute. You can imagine my surprise when I was told, many, many years ago that some of the foundational research on Alzheimer's was done years before they even knew what Alzheimer's was. And they said, can you tell me what institute do you think that research came out of? The Institute on Aging, that studies aging of the brain, the Institute on Neurological Disorders, or the Institute on Children and Human Development? And of course, my last guess was the latter. But the irony that we were researching dementia, years and years ago under the National Institutes for Children and Human Development because of the symptoms of dementia for those who have Down syndrome, the remarkable notion that research, well before its time, was paving the way for our understanding of how to treat, an epidemic today of Alzheimer's. How could my Aunt Eunice have known when she started the National Institutes for Child and Human Development, thinking of her sister Rosemary, that she'd end up creating an institute that would advance the understanding and treatment of a disease that now her 5 children are all worried that they're going to have, and are wondering whether those treatments are going to be there for them when they weren't there for their late father. And the notion that we're knocking on the door today to come up with better treatments, which have been made possible because of their mothers starting that institute, is beyond ironical. It's really spiritual. So we are engaged in this effort, and I appreciate the fact that all of you are part of this effort. And it is an effort to help improve the treatment of all people and treating people with human dignity. And for that, I want to thank you for the work that you've done in carrying on President Kennedy's legacy of caring about his fellow human being, and moreover, to look at all human beings as our sisters and brothers. And for that, thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you. Stretch those legs. Stretch those legs. Feels good. Thank you very much. So I don't know. I know we were running late when we started, which was okay for me. It meant I didn't have to talk quite as long. You might not believe that was something I was actually interested in doing, being a former politician. But I actually wanted to hear from you, and if you want to ask a question, I'll try to answer it. I have a sneaking suspicion that most of you in this room will know a lot more of the answers to these questions than I will. But if it's public policy related, I'll have a better chance of getting an opportunity to answer it for you. I think I see Andy over here who has a question right here.
Thank you, Patrick. Andy Imparato with AUCD. As somebody who has bipolar disorder, has been open about it, I really want to thank you for your courage and your witness and example. And I guess I know you're doing a lot of work with these forums around mental health around the country. And I'm just wondering if you can share what the folks in the room can do to be supportive of what you're doing to try to raise the profile of those issues.
Do you know now why I called on Andy? That was not a setup, I could have been, though. But thank you, Andy. We don't have the level of kind of benchmarking in terms of outcomes-based measurements that other areas of medicine have, and we, particularly in the mental health and substance use disorder area, we really need to take it up a notch in terms of promoting accountability metrics, where providers will now be expected to deliver on whatever is the latest evidence-based intervention. This sounds so obvious, but even when we got the parity bill passed, which basically says that payers now need to be accountable, meaning they've got to start paying, and the way we crafted the legislation, whether you're inpatient in-network or outpatient in-network, or inpatient out-of-network or outpatient out-of-network, or needing pharmacy or ER benefits. If you treat the stroke patient, the cardiovascular disease patient, the cancer patient, in any of those 6 buckets, and you reimburse for their illnesses in any of those 6 buckets, then you have to pay for brain illnesses too, in a like way. So, we've got, as you've seen with this latest DSM-5, multitude of various diagnoses, all kind of requiring various different types of treatment responses and the like. We need to begin to bring some understanding and outcomes-based measurement for the delivery of these services. Many people feel there's a stigma because they feel there's no difference that can be made in a person's life with treatment and with intervention. And a lot of the treatments and interventions for those of us, Andy, who have mental illness are actually born from the experience of the intellectual and developmental disability movement. They are the kinds of supporting living services, the supportive housing services, the supportive employment services that really bring people back into the mainstream of life. And isn't it interesting that now the SPMI movement is learning from the IDD movement about their successes in developing these kind of communities of care, because they're exactly the kinds of non-medical interventions that are really left out for treatment of those with mental illness and substance use disorders, and yet they've been so helpful in helping to people with intellectual disabilities integrate themselves into the rest of the society. They ought to be available for those that could also benefit from them. So you may recall, Andy, because you worked on it very closely, was the Community Living and Supportive Services, the CLASS Act. It was my dad's effort within the original ACA to include a new entitlement. So you have SSDI, Medicare, and Medicaid. He would have started a new kind of insurance indemnity fund because there's no money now to pay for these supportive living services. Whether you have a child aging out with autism who needs supportive services, or someone with severe and persistent mental illness who needs, supportive housing and supportive services, or your uncle with Parkinson's needs it, or your grandparent with Alzheimer's needs it. Guess what? Everyone needs it. And we need to build that infrastructure into our system of care. And we need to be able to convince insurance companies that this is good for them, because they'll never be able to risk the coverage in a way that is, dignified to make sure that those who have these kind of continual needs, chronic care needs, get those needs met in the current insurance, style market. And even with the parity rule now applying to Medicare and Medicaid, and even with, the SSDI and Medicaid and Medicare, we still could use some great policy advancement in terms of developing this community living and supportive services. It was dropped at the last minute from the ACA, but I know that there's many in this room who know that that's something that we need to bring back. And speaking of political coalitions, talking about bringing people from diverse backgrounds and different experiences together for a common goal, in spite of the fact that all of their diagnoses may be different, their common goal is the same. And you could really marry Autism Speaks, which is one of the most powerful, advocacy organizations, and with Alzheimer's Foundation, which is the next most powerful, with Iraq-Afghan War Veterans of America, which is trying to build these community support services for our returning heroes from Iraq and Afghanistan who are suffering from traumatic brain injury. Can you imagine 3 more powerful advocacy organizations in Washington, D.C. than those 3? What I'm basically telling you is we can do this. So the kind of policy development that you come up with through, ground rounds like this and through other, efforts of the JFK centers and centers like that across the country, our time is now, because veterans have suffered the signature wound of war, which is putting them in the same set of categories in terms of their needs as everyone with an intellectual developmental disability. This would be a golden time for us to all finally put our arms around one another and say, let's do this together, and let's make a difference that can help people from all walks of life. That, my friends, is a winning political coalition.
How are you integrating the role of nutrition and nutritional deficiencies when it comes to mental health?
Well, we have to look at putting together a priority list of what we would do with our first dollar if we had a dollar. And frankly, the biggest traumatic brain injury in the world is not TBI, but it's fetal alcohol syndrome. And that's not severe fetal alcohol, it's fetal alcohol syndrome where you may not even know the child's been affected right away because the mother didn't think it was a big deal to have a couple of glasses of wine. We don't even know what the full impact of that is. But now we've got all these new drugs on board. And we're not treating people, so we let their illness pathologize, even if they're an expectant mother. Are you kidding me? If you want to start someplace, let's start trying to intervene where you're going to help both people, the mom and the child, and where, frankly, we need to go back to an age where all expectant mothers get that kind of support, like the Nurse-Family Partnership outlines. It's federal policy that hasn't fully been implemented. I mean, when I was in Congress, they cut nurse midwives for mothers on Native American reservations. Are you kidding me? This is where we've got so far to go. Now, you include all the women and infant children, the WIC nutrition issues, which, WIC was intended to try to address nutrition. You've got to keep in mind that these can't be pieces of the puzzle that aren't fit in for the whole mosaic to make sense. So if you want, healthy people, you need to start from a multitude of places, and you've got to put those pieces of the puzzle together so that it's an integrated picture, and nutrition clearly, and early intervention for things like fetal alcohol syndrome and other things that are absolutely preventable, that those things are done as a matter of national policy. And if they are, you're not going to have these nutritional deficits. You're not going to have the lead paint problem that we had in Rhode Island. We had amongst the highest lead-based poisoning of children in this country in Rhode Island, because we're an old industrial state. And Rhode Island was the only state to win a class action lawsuit against the paint companies, which was then overturned by a Rhode Island Supreme Court. Would have been the only one of its kind in the nation. And you know about all the Shriver centers that do work to clear houses to make sure children don't end up. So, we got to come after this in a number of different levels. If their brain's developing, we need to make sure it's developing in a healthy way. Let's reduce the toxins. Let's increase the nutrients. That's where I come out on. Is that a good strategy? Thank you for the question.
Hi there. My name is Catherine Carroll. I'm with the Colorado Developmental Disabilities Association and Families at the Forefront of Technology. I have a two-part question for you. One is, like President Kennedy, who inspired so many of us to go into the field of social services, what's the vision, the clear and present vision, 2020 vision for the year 2020? How do we know we've reached the place that we need to be? And I'm not seeing a vision in the places that I'm looking for.
Right.
I think families have that an awful lot. And then I'm wondering about how do we kind of take the best from the 20th century, but really realize that we're operating in the 21st century.
Yes.
It's moving very rapidly. Where does technology feed into in our partnerships with the technology companies? How does that take us forward? And how does it get in the hands of people with disabilities? Because our current Medicaid system does not really support those kinds of things.
Yes.
And I'm finding the bureaucracy is very challenging. I've certainly, along with a lot of other people, working with that. But how do we move forward so that people are not experiencing 21st century segregation?
So, we have another golden opportunity right now, aside from the one I mentioned about building a coalition across different political interest groups. And that is the federal government is internally going through a major kind of crisis as to what it's going to do with this SSDI and with Medicaid and going forward with entitlements. You know that, this is the time we've got to keep the foot on the accelerator to fight for the interests of people who have the least voice. And yet, I think we can build a coalition and we could build out the use of technology in a way that solves both the, narrow challenges of the budget bean counters and the broader interests of this community. And that means that we fully employ those kinds of remote technologies that allow people to be connected to one another, that facilitate their connection to their family and friends. We could do that to enhance the kind of care provided so that it's provided, at the right time and place, and that it's supported in every way. So I think those opportunities are available to us, but I think we need the kind of advocacy that you're clearly illustrating to help us put together what that answer is. I would go to you for that answer because I know that you've got that answer. Now the question is, how do we take that answer and package it so that it could be really understood and adopted within the payer system. But if you get me something on this, I would be happy. I'm going to see the Chief Medical Officer of CMS in 2 weeks. And I would be happy to take any list of ideas that you have for CMS, for Medicare and Medicaid, on what they should be paying for and why they're not paying for this or that. I'd be happy to take it with me, and I don't mean physically, but electronically. Wouldn't that be beautiful? So we'll catch up after this.
We're working really hard in Colorado to try to integrate a mental health treatment for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but we are having a hard time figuring out the funding streams because they're just so complicated in Colorado. And I'm wondering if you're working at the federal level to try to coordinate some of those various funding streams for mental health treatment.
Well, you know, the whole concept of the ACA was obviously to build on this notion that we could no longer fund just services, but fund outcomes and really begin to employ what's going to make a real difference in a person's life to help them achieve their outcomes. And then let's pay for that. Because we spend a lot of money, I mean a lot of money, providing services for people for aspects of their illness that, you know, aren't the most pressing challenges they face. And yet not spending anything on the things that can make the biggest difference in their life. And so I think with this CMS announcement for kind of performance-based, you know, measuring, do we know yet what that means for people with intellectual disabilities or people with mental illness? We do not. We don't have a clue. And yet HHS is driving down this road on performance-based outcomes. And I have to tell you, you know, I'll work with Andy or anyone else, but I think we need to figure out, you know, what our message is going to be in terms of making sure they don't forget us. Right, and so that they really are thinking about how to what is integrating, coordinating services for people with intellectual disabilities means, and how are we going to get that through these new systems of care. Because they're all talking about developing much broader systems of care and integrating supportive housing services, supportive employment services. You know, that actually is the domain of this community. They understand those integrations. But so I think there could be a real nexus here where we could learn from one another in this healthcare transformation that we're going through right now.
So even if the insurance company's inclination is to game the system of parity so that they don't have to pay more for mental health and behavioral health services, now that we're begun as of this week to transition toward a value-based purchasing decision, and knowing that every 5 or 10 years somebody comes up with some good data that shows the multiplier effect of the comorbidities of depression and other mental illnesses on the cost of treating chronic conditions, where do we begin to generate data that would impact the bean counters at the insurance companies of a value-based purchasing decision that treats mental illness because of its financial multiplier effect on comorbidities of chronic conditions? Where do we start that analytic dialogue?
Well, as you know, there's been a lot of thinking that's gone into that, and already a lot of evidence that shows that. The question is, where politically do we start? And I think a real opportunity for us is to demonstrate how our prison and jail system is an absolute failure, because what it's ended up doing is incarcerating people, many of whom have intellectual disabilities, substance use disorders, or mental illnesses. And I think if you take those just in the jail, those are those people who get rounded up, can't pay their bail, get stuck in jail for interminable periods of time because they can't make bail. They're mentally ill in many cases. They have these chronic illnesses that are not addressed, and they are just like the frequent flyers in the ER. They are the frequent visitors of our jails and prisons. I think if we started as a nation on making sure that every single person coming out of jail with a diagnosis gets the proper kind of case management and integrated system of care. Why? Because now we've got a consensus on both the right and the left in this country. This is no longer being soft on crime. It's being called smart on crime. It's called right on crime because so many right-wingers are now on this mantra. This is a chance for us to say, let's reallocate all of those wasted police and law enforcement dollars, all those wasted, judges' times and court times and jail times and all that, and put all those dollars and really show the big benefit. And I think you could get people mobilized and you could start moving us down the road. We have to start where there is some obvious gains to be made in a short term. The other is obviously in the ERs. There's many urban hospital centers that just haven't grappled with the chronic health needs of those that are coming within their doors, and they continue to run up the bill. Now, these ACOs are meant to kind of develop an alternative system of care so they don't have to overutilize the ER, but that hasn't happened yet. In fact, the number of ACOs that are employing a system of care approach in this chronic care behavioral health model is very slim to none, even after all these years of reading about this in all these big periodicals. Oh, this is the new coming age, integrated, reduce comorbidities, let's treat the whole person. And yet it's still not happening. I would say, those are two areas. Finally, I think we should get a CEO roundtable, like cancer has a roundtable, and really and heart disease has a roundtable, and really push those things from the employer side, so this doesn't just become kind of a disability rights issue per se, but it becomes a more global issue of economic growth and vitality as a nation. Because if the CEOs were ever to really look at what's going on in their human resources and marry that, with their health plans, they probably could get a really good PricewaterhouseCoopers that came up to them and said, Mr. CEO, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You've got to do a much better job on the employee assistance program. You've got to integrate it so that they're not left waiting for 3 months for a first initial, physician's visit. You can't have inability for their child to get care, because if you do that, they're offline. Okay, your employee is offline when their child isn't being taken care of. We can measure that stuff now. PricewaterhouseCoopers, the others, they have this data, but we've got to assemble the political case, just as you started to do, and then make that case. And when we make that case, we've got to make it as a community. As I said, Iraq, Afghan war veterans, Alzheimer's, Autism Speaks, Down Syndrome Coalition. We've got to all put it together and say we're in this together because we've got a common goal. Yes.
I'd just like to ask, as a parent of an adult son with a disability, if there is recognition or any kind of understanding at your level about some support that's really needed for family caregivers and the importance for that in
Yes.
really saving all the taxpayers
Yes.
a lot of money.
Amen.
Because it's those caregivers who are going to be there throughout the lifetime.
Yes.
And again, talk about something that crosses disabilities, crosses all ages.
That's right.
If we don't support the caregivers and put some kind of respite funding or some help in place, you're really just looking at increasing the mental health issues. I can tell you about a lot of parents who
Right.
have a lot of mental health issues because of all the stress and the
That's right.
financial needs. So is there a discussion around this that's coming into play when we're talking about the broader aspect of really supporting people with disabilities, because it needs to include family caregivers as well?
Amen. Amen. As you know, my cousin Maria Shriver has made that her big charge. And, this is really coming from all corners now. And I'm sorry if I neglected to mention how that is a nexus point for everybody, because caregiver support is what can unite the whole disability community. And I remember when we were doing the parity fight, we had the whole disability, not just those with the invisible disabilities, but all the wheelchairs came and supported us, and it was because everybody knew they had a common stake in this. And caregivers transcend all of these challenges, and it's a great place where there's often division and fragmentation in our separate advocacy for us to all come together. So I think going back to this community living and support services, that part of this notion is to develop a funding stream to allow for this respite care, supportive services to really relieve the primary caregiver, who is the loved one, from being burned out and from being pushed over the edge themselves. That would be part of the benefit of having a class act actually pass. And I know, as Andy does, that this is now gaining some steam in Washington. So, get in touch with your advocates who are got the portal to these issues, because I think we're going to see more of this get brought together in this class act proposal that's now going to be coming down in the next few years.
So, Patrick, we really appreciate you being here to help us celebrate what is really an important 50th anniversary. As you can tell, we're very proud of what we have accomplished over the last 50 years in Colorado, but we also really appreciate your challenging us to what we need to do for the next 50 years. And I think you have really given us a set of goals that we can aspire to. So thank you very much for being here.